I'm going to give you a preview of my forthcoming book, Enlightenment Now. The last word of the subtitle is progress. It is a major theme of the book. And I wrote it in part because I discovered that intellectuals hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. If you think that we can solve problems, then you have a blind faith or a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition of the false promise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-doism with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and, of course, a Pangloss named after the Voltaire character who declared, "We all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds." Well, my reply is that progress need not be associated with any of these temperaments or philosophies, that rather progress is an empirical hypothesis. Namely, human well-being can be measured. Life, health, sustenance, wealth, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, and happiness. If they have increased over time, that is progress. Well, let's look at some of the data. We can begin with the most basic dimension of human well-being of all, life and health. And we see a pattern that is, you will see over and over again whenever you map out some dimension of human well-being. Namely, before the Enlightenment, in, say, the early 18th century, basically the entire world was miserable and abject. Then Europe and the Americas, the United States, North America, started to pull away from this state of universal misery. Here we see that the average lifespan in Europe, in the 18th century was about 30. That's pretty much where it had been parked for thousands of years before. But then starting in the 19th century, the lifespan of Europeans dramatically increased. That was quickly followed by the Americas, then Asia, and more recently Africa. Here you have the plot for the entire world. The average life expectancy today is 71 across the entire world, averaging over rich and poor countries and including all of the premature deaths from 0-year-old infants. Virtually no one guesses that the world's average lifespan is that high. Child mortality follows a similar pattern. In Sweden, one of the world's most advanced countries, in the 18th century, 1/3 of all children died before their 5th birthday, and that declined to very close to 0 over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. That was then followed by countries in the Americas, such as Canada, then Asia, South Korea, even in the 20th century had a rate of child mortality similar to Sweden's in the 18th century, but it has come down. Chile and African countries are following suit. Here you have the graph for Ethiopia, which represents sub-Saharan Africa. Likewise, maternal mortality. A couple of centuries ago, a woman had a 1% chance of dying in childbirth. Childbirth in the 18th century was as lethal as breast cancer is today. Sweden brought the rate down, followed by the United States, Asian countries such as Malaysia, and now we're seeing Africa catch up as well. That's the graph for Ethiopia. Sustenance. Famine used to be a regular occurrence in all parts of the world. But starting with the agricultural revolution in the 18th century, the number of calories available to a person started to shoot up, first in England, United States, and France. But then more recently, China has caught up. Even India, long associated with famine, now exports grain. And here we have the graph for the world as a whole. The average for the world is the number of calories needed for an active middle-aged man. The increase in calories is not just going to make rich people fatter, but it is also preventing the stunting of children. The United States for a long time has not had malnourished children, but as recently as the 1960s, 40% of children in South America were stunted. That has been brought down to less than 10%. Likewise, we see a decline of stunting in China, followed by Kenya, sub-Saharan African country, and Bangladesh. As a result, famine deaths have been decimated, and whereas famine used to be a threat everywhere on Earth, now there are just a few pockets in Africa that are vulnerable to famine. Prosperity. Here you have a graph of prosperity in the world from the year 1 to the year 2000. For thousands of years, everyone was poor. Then, starting with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, there was a 200-fold increase in the gross world product. Once again, that did not unfold evenly across the world's regions. The UK was the first, overtaken by the United States. But then, more recently, South Korea has almost caught up. Chile, China, and you see India accelerating as well. This pattern is sometimes called the Great Convergence. As a result, extreme poverty, which is the inability to feed oneself and one's family, has been decimated. In the 19th century, 90% of the world met the criterion for extreme poverty. That has now been reduced to 10%, and the United Nations has set the goal of eliminating extreme poverty from the face of the earth by the year 2030, which means that most of us might live to see the day in which extreme poverty will vanish from the face of the earth. As a result, for all the talk of increased inequality within wealthy Western countries, globally inequality is decreasing because poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer. Here you have two estimates of an international Gini index showing this recent decline. As countries become richer, they devote more of their wealth to helping the worse off, the children, the poor, the sick, the aged. Every affluent country devotes at least 20% of its GDP now to social spending. For centuries, that figure was 1%. So here you have the data for France, Italy, Sweden, Germany, Greece, Netherlands, UK, and so on. It's a pattern that no affluent country escapes. Thanks to this social spending, poverty is being decimated within Western countries. Again, for all the talk about the problems with the American economy, the growth in inequality, what really counts, namely poverty, has been in a decline. Here you have the American poverty rate. If you take into account social spending, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, Social Security, and so on, and the decline is even more dramatic if you look at consumption, which is really what counts when you consider poverty. Namely, can people afford to feed themselves, clothe themselves, house themselves, and so on? By one estimate, the poverty rate in the United States was 30% in 1960. It has now fallen to 3% when measured by consumption. Peace. It used to be the case that war was the natural state of affairs and peace was merely an interlude between wars. This graph shows the percentage of time that the great powers of the day, that is the most powerful states and empires, fought wars against each other from 1500 to the present. And you can see that several hundred years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war. Now they are never at war. The last great power war took place more than 60 years ago, the Korean War, which pitted China against the United States. Even the wars that have taken place, mostly civil wars, kill a fraction of the people that they used to. Here we have the rate of death in wars from 1946 to the present. And it's been a bumpy ride. There are spikes for the Korean War, for the Vietnam War, for the Iran-Iraq War. but we now see that the rate of death in war, which is about 1 per 100,000 per year, has fallen considerably from the 1950s when it was 22 per 100,000 per year. Freedom and rights have been in the ascent, despite some discouraging headlines. Notwithstanding the common claim that democracy is in retreat, that there's a democratic meltdown or rollback, the world has never been more democratic. This is a score of the average measure of democracy versus autocracy across the world's nations, and it shows that we are living in a time in which a majority of nations are more democratic than not, and a majority of people in the world live in democratic nations for the first time in history. Human rights are harder to quantify, but there has been one data scientist who's tried to quantify human rights violations such as summary executions, imprisoning dissidents, and so on. The gold standard for human rights is to be found in Scandinavian countries. And here we see that Norway started out in 1946 as having a high level of human rights, and it's gone even higher. The Koreas have gone in opposite directions. In the 1940s, there was very little difference between South Korea and North Korea. They were both dictatorships. South Korea has gotten as respected human rights increasingly. North Korea, as should be obvious, has gone downhill. A country like China, the opposite of a gold standard, is still has a higher level of human rights today than it certainly did during the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward of Mao Zedong. The world as a whole, with all of the backsliding, all of the Turkeys and Russias and Venezuelas, still shows an upward arc in progress toward human rights. One manifestation of respect for human life is in the death penalty, where country after country has abolished the death penalty. Here you see a timeline from 1863 to the present. Over the last couple of decades, every year, three countries abolish the death penalty. If the current trend continues, not to say that it will, the death penalty will vanish from the face of the earth by 2026. Homosexuality is being abolished in country after country, again, notwithstanding backsliding in countries like Uganda and Russia, but still the overall trend is for homosexuality to be decriminalized. And child labor has been, is being decimated. In 1850, about 30% of English children were in the workforce. That has gone to pretty much zero. Here you have the curve for England and the United States, for Italy, and for the world as a whole. There is still far too much child labor, but the trajectory is definitely downward. Safety. We have never been safer. Here you have a graph of homicide deaths over the last 50 years, showing that the United States has reduced its rate of homicide by more than 50%. England, too, has seen a 50% reduction since in the 21st century alone. And the world as a whole now has homicide rates of 70% of what it was just at the turn of the millennium. In the United States, violence against wives and girlfriends, domestic violence, has been decreasing, as has sexual assault and rape. Violence against children has been in decline. These figures are for the United States. The rate of children being beaten up or bullied at school has declined. The rate of physical abuse by caregivers and the rate of sexual abuse have come down. Our technology has become safer and safer. As far as I know, this is a universal law, and the reductions have been dramatic. An American today has about 1% of the chance of being killed in a car accident as his counterpart of a century before. Pedestrians are 20 times less likely to be mowed down on the sidewalk. People are about 1 million times less likely to die in a plane crash. People are less likely to fall to their deaths, less likely to drown, less likely to be burned to death in a fire, less likely to be asphyxiated by gas. One exception, The rate of poisoning by solids or liquids has gone up, and what you're seeing here is the American opioid epidemic. So it obviously is not the case that everything improves all the time. That would be magic, not progress. Americans are far less likely to be killed on the job. Again, a reduction of about 95%. And people the world over are less likely to die in earthquakes, floods, wildfires, mudslides, and meteor strikes. Here you have the rate of death from natural disasters. My favorite in these is if you think of the quintessential act of God, the bolt from the blue, that is being killed by a bolt of lightning. Americans now have 3% of the chance of being killed by a bolt of lightning as Americans of a century ago. Knowledge has been on the increase. It used to be that only about 15% of the world knew how to read and write in the early modern period. That first we see the Netherlands achieving universal literacy, then England, Germany, Italy a bit later, United States. And as with all the other measures of well-being, the rest of the world is catching up. Here you have the curve for China, for Mexico, and for the world as a whole. More than 80% of the world is literate now, and the illiterate people are all in their 70s and 80s. When they die off, the world will achieve close to 100% literacy. Likewise, basic education, the elementary school. Here we have the British offshoots, Western Europe, Eastern Europe a little later, East Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and South and East Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Once again, there is a lag, but that we are starting to see a convergence. There you have the figure for the world as a whole. Believe it or not, we are getting smarter. In a phenomenon called the Flynn effect, IQ scores have been increasing by 3 points a decade for a century, with the result that humans today are about 30 IQ points higher than their ancestors a century ago. Here you have the figures for each of the continents. What are we doing with all of this wealth and health? Well, we are enjoying life as opposed to slaving away at jobs. Work hours in Western Europe and the United States have been declining since the 19th century by about 22 hours a week. People spend less of their paycheck on food, clothing, and shelter. It used to be more than 60% of your paycheck went to the necessities of life. Now it's about 1/3. Thanks to the growth of appliances and utilities like running water, electricity, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, microwaves, the amount of time that we lose to housework has been steadily decreasing from more than 60 hours a week to less than 20. As a result of all of these, leisure time has increased by about 12 hours a week, more so for men than for women, and that's because women are using their extra time to spend more time with their children, which doesn't count as leisure time. Is it making us any happier? Well, probably yes. Here's a graph that shows the relationship between self-assessed life satisfaction and gross domestic product over countries. The richer the country, the happier the person on average. This data cloud shows a number of arrows indicating the relationship between happiness and income within each country. And as you can see, richer countries are happier, richer people within countries are happier, which means that as the world gets richer, on average, it gets happier. Well, how is the fact of human progress? All of these developments that I have shown you reflected in the news. Well, I'm going to show you a graph that is the result of a tone mapping algorithm where thousands of news stories from the New York Times since the 1940s are rated in terms of their ratio of positive words like better, improve, increase, good, to negative words like crisis, deterioration, horrible, and so on. And as you can see, since the 1940s, the New York Times has been getting more and more negative. It's not just the New York Times. This is a composite of broadcasts from media all over the world. So as the world has been getting better and better, the media have been getting more and more negative journalism. So why do intellectuals and journalists deny progress? It is just an overwhelming fact about the human condition, and the picture of the world given to us by the writers and thinkers is the opposite to reality. Well, one possibility is a psychological phenomenon discovered by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky called the availability heuristic. Namely, the human brain estimates probability according to how easily examples from memory pop into mind. So if you see news about a terrorist attack, you assume that terrorism is common. If you read about a shark attack, you don't go into the water. If you see a tornado, you think that tornadoes are a major cause of death, and so on. If you combine that with the famous watchword of news programming, namely, if it bleeds, it leads. Violent stories get the most attention, the most clicks, the most eyeballs, then you get the illusion that the world is more dangerous than it ever has been. I think that's not the only reason. There's a second psychological phenomenon behind it, the negativity bias, sometimes summarized by the slogan, bad is stronger than good. This summarizes the results of hundreds of experiments showing that people think and feel about bad events much more than good events, probably because there are so many more ways for things to go wrong than to go right now and in our evolutionary history, and the cost of missing a danger is much greater than the cost of failing to note a beneficial development. A third phenomenon is what I think of as the gravitas market. Namely, if you want to be taken seriously as a social critic, as a prophet, then it's much more clever to be pessimistic than optimistic. Pessimism sounds serious. Optimism sounds frivolous. As one business writer put it, pessimists sound like they're trying to help you. Optimists sound like they're trying to sell you something. Finally, a somewhat cynical explanation is that there's a status competition among elites. All of us seek to enhance the prestige of our tribe, our profession. And when intellectuals aren't responsible for running things, they just comment. When intellectuals disparage the state of the world, it's another way of undermining the prestige of politicians, civil servants, business people, the military, and so on. Well, is it good to be pessimistic? Is it socially responsible? Is it good to speak truth to power, to hold the powerful accountable, to afflict the comfortable? Well, it has a serious downside that I think we are only beginning to recognize, namely that fatalism, if all of the pictures of the state of the world are that it's going to hell in a handcart, it's a flaming dumpster, it's a disaster, everything is a crisis. Well, people are going to say, well, there's just, why waste time and money on a hopeless cause? I may as well just enjoy life, bring home my paycheck, bring up my children, and enjoy life while it lasts. And cynicism. For people who do want to change things, if they are told that every institution is failing, it's bound to encourage the philosophy of to smash the machine, to drain the swamp, to burn the empire to the ground. And it lays open a invitation for strong, charismatic leaders to say, only I can fix it. Now, is progress inevitable? I've shown a number of curves that just keep going up and up, and the answer is, of course not. There is no dialectic that carries us ever upward. There is no mystical arc of justice. And indeed, any solution will create new problems which have to be solved in turn, and history can always throw nasty surprises at us. And there have been a number of them. The 2 world wars, the increase in crime from the 1960s to the 1980s in every Western country, the AIDS epidemic in Africa, which reversed the increase in longevity. And as we are seeing today, the rise of authoritarianism in Russia, Turkey, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. There are major threats. undoubtedly, including prominent among them are nuclear war and climate change, although I do have to mention that these should not be seen as portents of inevitable doom either, that there are signs that these threats can begin to be mitigated. Here we have the number of nuclear weapons in the world from 1945 to 2015. Very few people are aware of the fact that the world's nuclear arsenal has been reduced by 85%. And about 10% of the electricity in the United States comes from decommissioned nuclear weapons, the ultimate swords into plowshares. We cannot expect this curve to be extrapolated to zero anytime soon, but it is not an idle dream. And as you probably know, some of the world's most vociferous Cold War hawks, like Ronald Reagan, like Henry Kissinger, like George Shultz, have called for a world without nuclear weapons. Likewise, the world's greatest challenge is undoubtedly climate change, but I think we ought not to see it as an unsolvable problem, as inevitable doom. This graph showing the trajectory of CO2 emissions suggests that the world has reached peak coal and might even have reached peak carbon. Here you have the European Union CO2 emissions, the United States, China, India, and other regions of the world. All in all, at least the rate of increase has come down. That is obviously not enough to address global warming, but it shows that industrial society is not on an inevitable path of indefinitely increasing CO2 emissions. I'm going to just throw this out, and I'm not going to defend it because it will segue into the next session. You can't worry about everything. We really should worry about nuclear war. We should really worry about climate change. I think worrying about runaway artificial intelligence of robots taking over, enslaving us, for reasons that I can expand later, I think is not an existential threat. So just to stay on time, I'm going to skip that. But I can go through it later if there is time, but I'm going to cede the floor to my fellow panelists. So progress is not a law of nature. I argue in the book that it is a gift of pursuing the ideals of the Enlightenment, namely reason, science, and humanism. These ideals must be identified and defended. They are what we have to thank for the progress that we have enjoyed. If we continue to pursue them, we can enjoy more progress. If we don't, we won't. And overall, what it shows is that human effort is not futile. Despite the headlines, humanity has made tremendous progress, and there is reasonable hope for much more. Thank you very much.